taking a look at the Pro-Q3, Saturn2, and Timeless 3. And let's dive right into the Pro-Q3 to start, shall we? So this is the Pro-Q3. It is a parametric equalizer, and to add filters, you simply click and you can just have your filters appear right there. And this is something that the Pro-Q3 really excels at, is maximizing screen space. So the controls you're showing are only ever the controls you're currently using. So if you click on the filter, it'll swap to that one. And you can even do really nice things like select multiple filters and make adjustments to the frequency or gain at once. So very, very cool stuff there. To remove a filter, you simply click the X. Let me show you the audio that we're going to be using to just mess with as we learn a little bit about the Pro-Q3. So this first audio piece, this track, is the drop sound. It is a pluck. It sounds like this. So that is the sound that we are going to be using. So right off the bat, something that's really nice to know about is the full screen mode. So if you click up here, it'll go to full screen and you can do your work and then close that when you're done. You also have various size options down in the corner. So we're going to go ahead and stay in full screen for a little while. And where you add the filter is going to determine what kind of filter is added. So if you add a filter in the middle, it'll default to peaking. If you wish to change this, you could simply click right here and you could choose your filter type. You could choose a notch filter, for example. And if you add a filter on the side where the grid sort of looks a little more open, you will see that we get shelving filters on the sides. So that is some of the filter options. Now with the filters, you have access to some incredibly steep filters. So if we come in here and add a low cut, we can have a very gentle low cut. And of course, you could scroll your mouse wheel to change the Q and all that good stuff. But if we come into this drop down, you'll see you have access to a 72 dB, a 96 dB, and a brick wall filter. So if you bring up the brick wall filter, it's just a crazy brick wall, super incredibly steep filter. So very, very cool to have access to this. If you really want a sharp defined line where just nothing passes this point, this is the EQ that's going to give it to you. The Pro-Q3 is also a dynamic equalizer, which allows you to do things like de-essing or multiband compression in a very visual way. So if we go ahead and add a point here, so we've got ourselves a peaking filter, and right now it's just a static cut or boost. And let's say that instead of having this cut here all the time, we only want it to cut when the audio reaches a certain threshold, because otherwise we might be removing stuff that we don't necessarily want to remove all the time. We only want to remove it when it gets too loud. For example, when we're de-essing something, a speaker, for example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a filter over here, and I'm going to simply bring down above the gain knob this control. And you see it activates this green region. And by default, the threshold is set automatically. So I usually find auto to be very nice. It works very quickly. And you get yourself a dynamic equalizer. You're doing some multiband compression. If we go ahead and really push this, you can also do expansion with it. And let's say that you want to set the threshold yourself or use a sidechain input. If you simply click on auto, it'll open up the sidechain input option and you can set the threshold yourself. So if this is something you'd like to do, I often find this to be fantastic for, well, there's a lot of reasons why this would be fantastic, but something I really like to do is set a shelving filter like this. So you see it's a shelving filter because I clicked over here. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of expansion there. And this can give you snapback. Sometimes some kicks, when you record them, are very dull. And this is a way to get some of that snap back in your kick. You might add a little bit over here to take care of a nodal region that's perhaps being a problem. Or you could even use this to do very specific side chaining. And just have a little bit of compression down here. And really clean up a sound as well as have an EQ. So if you want to cause a static cut, but then have it go further when it gets too loud, you can do stuff like that. It's really, really cool. And the final basic option I really want to show you here, actually there's two more things, is the spectral mode. So a lot of the times, right, when we're looking for peaks in our signal, we set up a very high value peaking filter and we sweep it around and listen for resonances. Well, here you can just hover your mouse over it and it will do a spectral freeze, and you can see the nodes indicate the highest points in the signal. So if you have a recording you're trying to clean up, get rid of those resonances, you could simply click and drag down and remove resonances really, really quickly. So that's really nice. As well as with that, you may have noticed that it's related to the keyboard. So let's say, for example, this key, F sharp, is a very important note in this particular track. So I could come down here, look at my keyboard, and double click and add a node right at F sharp. And I can go ahead and make my adjustments here. This is great if you have a kick drum down here, for example, and you want it to land right on the money for the note of the key to reinforce that. You could give a boost, and then you could cut other things right at that specific node. You can do that. Another thing I should mention too, man, there's a lot actually now that I'm thinking about all this stuff, is if you come down here to the analyzer, it'll actually see all the other EQs in the project. And if you click on them, it'll show you where they're masking. So if you want to see how your kick and your snare are interfering with each other, or maybe your kick and your bass, more reasonable example, you can see that. This is a pluck sound, not really going to have that problem, but you see it appears in red if there's heavy masking. And just a brief reminder, masking is not always a bad thing. It could be a very good thing and help glue your mix together. It's just at times certain masking, like the bass and the kick, can be a very bad thing. When you get higher up, masking is not usually as much of a problem. And this brings me to my favorite thing about the Pro-Q3, and that's that these bands that we have here can be split into their different channels. So right now, this is a stereo move. And you can see down here it says stereo. But we can break it, and you can actually click the scissors to split it automatically, then to left, right. But you can also go mid-side. So if I go to the side, I can grab just the reverb. And so, for example, if we switch this to a shelving filter and bring this up, we could boost the high-end reverb, or it'll be mostly reverb because that's mostly the side signal. In fact, we could bring this down and we could pop it up as an expander and use it to augment the attack of the sound. We could add in another filter, and we could come in and change this to a mid filter. So it's going to affect the body of the sound mostly in this particular case. And I could do a cut around the same region. I could remove some fundamental and instead experiment with having mostly verb here by doing the same thing. Probably not the greatest idea for this particular sound, but you get the idea. All right, for this next example, I am using the Pro-Q3 in a more advanced way. Sometimes I like to use equalizers as filter boxes. So typically in a synthesizer, you're given like the cutoff and the resonance. That's usually it. Where here, we can add filters, automate them around to create really difficult to make filter shapes if you were to try and do this with just regular filter approaches with just knobs. And not only that, but here, for example, this is a mid filter. I could switch this to only filter the side. I can have an expander moving around. I can have a notch filter moving around. And so the whole idea here is I'm automating all of these things. I'm just automating the frequency, but I'm doing things that allow me to change the space of the sound in really interesting ways. So typically, you're going to want to use the mid filters for the main body of the filter sound, and you're going to want to use the side stuff for if you want to get it like the reverb. So I'll show you both, but here we could see there is a bunch of automation. So this is the automation of the various filters sort of doing their things, and they're moving around this bass sound. And if we pull open the Pro-Q3 and just take a look at this, so we can see here there's one giant low pass filter that's responsible for the bulk of the rhythm. This thing, the bump, womp, and then all these others are interesting side things that we're doing. So for example, this is affecting the side channel I could go ahead, I could boost the expansion up some on this one and make it only affect the side. And it has an immediate effect upon the sound because this is only side information. If I had a reverb adding, you know, a significant amount of reverb, a stereo reverb, then this would bring that reverb right up. If we go over to mid, you'll hear a huge difference. So a much sharper sound because, right, most of the sound's living in the center there. And that's the power of the Pro-Q3. When you see something that allows you to do stuff like this, I mean, I immediately think of stuff like this, where you could create pretty sophisticated filter movements with minimal effort. It's pretty wild, the power that you have here. So that is the Pro-Q3. We're going to go ahead and move over to Saturn2 now. All right, this is Saturn2. You will notice it also has a beautiful full screen mode. This is something that FabFilter just nails. And once again, just a ton of options here. Let me go ahead and open up a default Saturn2 so you can see just things from the beginning here. And let's turn this first one off. And I have soloed this bass sound. So right off the bat, you get what you would expect out of a regular distortion unit. You have a drive control, big drive control right in the middle, and you can turn this up to apply the algorithm to it. So we've got here a bunch of different algorithms. Some of these are meant for guitars, amplifiers, for example. And for example, we've got subtle tube, and some of these are meant for mastering. If we move up through the ranks, so that's subtle, so this would be intended for mastering. But if we go up to clean, I'm going to leave it really high just so you can hear the differences. So that's broken tube. And so on and so forth. So that's subtle tape. So you have a bunch of options in here. There are a few that are kind of special. If you go down to the effects section, you've got this smudge option. Yeah. So there are a few special ones in here as well. Saturn2 really upgraded the modulation from Saturn1. And if you come down here to add source, we can add different modulation sources to it. So for example, let's add a slider, and it's also multiband. You can come up here and click and add in. So for example, one of the main principles of distortion, at least for most of the basic distortions, is when you distort something using a standard method, not one of these like fancy effects ones, the harmonics that are added, if you have proper aliasing, which if you come down here to, or anti-aliasing, I mean, you have high quality mode, you come down and select good or superb, that'll pretty much take care of the aliasing. When you distort a band, it'll only add frequencies above that band. So if we do a band split and then we go to the top, we can separate the low end and leaving the harmonics alone, especially if you have like a sub or the low end's just the way you want it. And we can go over to where a lot more of this harmonically interesting content's happening, and we can distort this. So for example, if we add a tube, we could brighten this up. And something I like to do is as I add moves like this, I sometimes like to add a slider that I'll sometimes automate, and I'll attach it to the various EQ controls here. And on each EQ control, I will, well, let's go ahead, let's grab it here. I will give it various abilities to on the modulation depth, so that as I move this, you can see they move, and I can sort of auto balance whatever move I'm doing, so that as I add, you know, drive, I can automate this up and down and sort of tune it how I want it automatically. And what's nice about this is you can use the same slider on multiple bands. So let's say that as that one goes up, we'd like this one, you know, to go down. And we can make this negative, so it'll go down, but not too much. So we're going to reduce how far it can go down. And so in this way, I can sort of have a slider that will adjust across all the bands at the same time. And I can very quickly audition settings. So some modulation possibilities here. Sliders are extremely powerful. Another thing I like to do is if you grab the XY controller, Very common thing is I'll come into where the input drive and output are, and on X, I'll hook it up so that X is positive for one and X is negative for the other. So that as I move the X control, they move in opposite directions. And this is going to affect how it hits the various bands, and this can have some really nice effects and do a little bit of gain movement for you. And let's move the drive up here a little bit more, and let's have a different algorithm down here. We'll use clean tape just to have some interesting happen, really noticeable. So this is driving the input really high and the output is being reduced a lot. So you're going to get very squashed down this way. If we go the other way, it's going to reduce the input, so that's going to hit the drive different. So this is going to determine, like, when you go to the X on the input, maybe you want it to be negative as well, so it'll drive both really high, and maybe you flip the output for this case. And of course, you can just go for a giant gain boost. But the XY control in particular, I think, excels really well at this, because what you could do then is you can move the Y to control things like the drive on this one and the drive on this one. Maybe we'll invert this one. And down here, if you click on any little area where there's a dot, we can invert that as well. So let's go back to that setup. So very, very nice. There are a bunch of other sources in here. You can have LFOs. So for example, I could hook this up to where the band control is moving, and I could have this alter it. So maybe I have one that has smudge, for example. So let's bring this way down because smudge is kind of crazy. It's an effect, and as this moves back and forth, this is going to alter what part of the spectrum is getting the smudge. In fact, we could move this up here. We'll change this to something safer like subtle tube. And on this one, we'll leave it on smudge and bring it up a bit. So we'll move this. So this is going to affect where the smudge is happening, and we'll have some top end always being left alone. Yeah. And we could go ahead, pop this open. You could use this as a sequencer, by the way. It's in free mode. We could do in steps of quarter notes. Let's go to 1/4. And we can bring the glide down to bring it to more of a square shape. And we could add 4 steps and sort of have it go between those according to your DAW's tempo. And then if we really want an excessive effect, we could bring this way up. But this is just the craziness in modulation. You just get further and further and further into it. We haven't even touched the feedback, frequency, or dynamics yet. So you can treat the dynamics as you're going as well, which could be really useful. Let's look at an example here that I have in the track that I've sort of tuned to be what I want. And this one features the feedback in the frequency. So feedback's really cool, but a lot of feedback controls typically are just one knob that says feedback, where here you can also choose where the frequency happens, and with the right sounds, this can give you some beautiful resonance. It's fantastic to have in a distortion. So this is just a single band distortion. I'm not doing anything fancy with all the bands. And I have an LFO here, sort of just moving the drive back and forth, create some interesting rhythm. That was the thought behind that. But here, the combination of this feedback amount and this frequency, I decided to automate these two. And I'm using warm tube. So warm tube is one of the more aggressive algorithms, especially as you drive it high. And combined with feedback, it'll be really, really noticeable. As opposed to if you do clean tube or subtle tube, these are less coloring. So I didn't choose these. And broken tube's just like really aggressive. So that's why I chose warm tube. And here, okay, so we've got this going on. Let me make sure this is a floating window. It is. And if we come over here and look at what's going on in the project, we have here some automation. Let's go ahead and detach this and look at this. So this top one is the feedback amount, and this bottom one is the feedback frequency. And if we were to mute these and just listen to it, that movement, that ba-da-ba-da-ba, that's the note's flat. It's actually this that's creating that movement. Now let's go ahead and add in this automation. Yeah, this particular moment right here. And this is, you might be wondering, why is it changing slightly? That has to do with the drive moving back and forth. So I'm hitting the drive at different points in the cycle. But that is like some glorious stuff. So this is something that if you're looking for sounds that really emphasize that resonance, this frequency control that's been added is a fantastic tool for that. And with that, let's go ahead and move on over to Timeless 3, shall we? All right, so this last example is a cyberpunk style track, and I have this lead here, and by default, let me go ahead and bypass Timeless 3 here, and let's just hear it real quick. So pretty standard stuff. When it rings out, and eventually just fades away. Let's go ahead, let's add Timeless 3 to this mix and show you just one of the things this can do. Yeah, so what we're doing here is we're using this to bring up those swells and they become much more interesting. Something comes in and goes away. So by far right now, my favorite thing to do with Timeless 3 is this exact move. Let's go ahead and open up a basic Timeless 3 and walk you through sort of how this thing does what it does, and then we will dive further in as we go. So Timeless 3 also recently got a big overhaul, especially to the modulation, but Timeless 3 in particular got a massive overhaul to just the entire interface. So now we have a delay control right here in the center, which is a lot more familiar. We'll also see we've got a taps display area. So this is going to be extremely visual. So the top and the bottom are your two stereo channels. And if we want to separate them in time, we can simply do so with this top part of the delay control called the delay pan control. So if we bring this delay down really short, do the short one, bring it up, get a very long one. And if we pan this around, we can get some nice stereo separation that way as well. And you still have the cross-channel feedback mixing right here. It's still included. So these appear as sort of these yellower looking things. And this brings me to, if you want to do the technique I just showed you, all you have to do is come into the taps area and there's a little menu and you can generate your taps this way. So I usually use random and then I'll automate the feedback. You get almost a reverb type effect. And here we've now got the addition of some really nice effects that are all fully automatable. So for example, we could turn on diffusion and let me just pump this way up. You get a much smoother sound. You could do pitch, for example. This is extremely useful for vocals. We could bring down the pitch. Let's bring it down an octave. Up an octave. And you might go, hey, that movement up the octave is pretty cool. I'd like to use that. Well, you could do that. You could bring in an LFO and you could sequence it in and link it up to the pitch if you want. You could create a sync, maybe quarter notes, so each one would be a quarter note, and you can have it be 0 and then come up at the end. if you can move the knob in that way, you can either automate it yourself or you can create a modulation source to do that for you. We've also got control over the dynamics, a lo-fi control. And of course, a drive. So one of the things I like to do, especially to inspire ideas on like what kind of modulation setup should I try, a lot of times they have things already here that are already set up, and you can go through the presets. A lot of fantastic ideas in the presets, especially with the filters. But what I like to do is just add a slider and just connect this one slider to a bunch of things at once. And at some point, you're going to wish that something could move independently. And this is going to start giving you ideas on where you can go from there. So this is one of the workflow ways I like to do to come up with useful modulations that are still musical. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and set this up to control the drive. And we'll leave it at, right around there. And I'm going to go ahead and bring this down so that when I pump this up, you see it begins to come up. And maybe a bit further. I'm going to grab it and have it control the lo-fi. Maybe I'll leave the lo-fi where it's at, and I'll actually have it be negative, so it'll pull it back. And we'll give it a little more range. And I'll also have it control the diffusion. So maybe I'll start with the diffusion around halfway. I'll drag this on and let it push it up the rest of the way. So when it's down, and I also want it to be connected to that feedback control because that's a really natural effect to just fade in and out. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this up as well so that when this moves, that'll move with it. And we have this nice sort of shimmer effect that comes through, and it's something that we can directly control. Something else you might try doing that I think is really a handy tool is right here we've got just a drum loop. And it's moving it around, in interesting ways. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lose all this stuff. And I just want to have an XY controller. And this time we're going to hook up X to the wet dry. So we're going to give X total control over the positive so that when it's positive, it's all the way wet. When it's negative, it's 100% dry. And then we're going to let Y change an LFO. So we're going to add an LFO here. And this LFO, we're going to give it quarter notes. And we're going to sync it to the delay. And this delay is going to start off very low. Going to give it a high glide. Okay, so we're going to have this control the offset of when this occurs, and we're also going to have it control the depth of this control. So you can have a modulation source control a modulation source. So when Y is all the way down, the delay you can see goes down. When Y is up, the delay goes up. And so what this is going to do is it's going to mix between wet and dry. And then the Y is going to control this delay for us. And we can use this to generate patterns, essentially. And let's pump the delay variation up some. Let's remove a few steps and just have it be 2 steps. And here we might add a 3rd step and have it be somewhere in the middle. And at this point, let's add some lo-fi. Let's add a little bit of diffusion. And you have a cool fading effect. You could use it to transition. And this is just the beginning of what you could do here. You could create a sort of pattern generator. You could hook things up in slightly different ways. We could mess with the drive and the dynamics also, especially with drums, could be a really cool effect. But that's just a little bit of what's possible with Timeless 3 and some ideas that you could try out and explore. Thanks for watching and have a blessed day.